Hey guys, welcome to The Syndicate, the show where I get the innovators, thought leaders, and world's best investors on. Today we've got one of those thought leaders and innovators. We've got Pascal Finet. I hope I'm saying that right. I'm pretty sure he's French, just from the accent, which is quite awesome on the program. Pascal's here from Singularity University. There he's working with startups, innovators, trying to change the world, and he's done quite a bit of that at to be honest, you've worked at most of the big companies at this point in the internet era. And yeah, thanks for coming today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And perfect pronunciation, by the way. So thank you for having me.
Perfect pronunciation, terrible intro. So let's hear a little bit more. What is your story? How did you get here?
It's you indicated this probably right. It's a bit of a longer story, and I semi-joke that I probably have a bit of ADHD, so I don't stay at companies for all that long. But the shorter version is I ping-ponged between starting my own companies and working for some of the more interesting tech companies, very often in their formative years. So I was at, you indicated this, I was at eBay in Europe when eBay Europe was about 100 people. And I saw this like just incredible exponential, truly exponential growth there. I was part of the the team at Mozilla when we just released Firefox version 3, and the web browser was really like heating up, and it was a really fascinating time. I saw the launch of Google Chrome, of course, and then I was at Google.org just at the time when Google.org was kind of like refining itself. So I've seen a few of those things, and then in between, I also started my own companies as well as did a little bit of venture capital. Where I brought a venture capital firm, which I co-founded from Berlin to London. So my background is mostly in Europe. And about 10 years ago, I came to the Valley, originally with Mozilla. And since about 5 years, I'm with Singularity University I have the real privilege to do a whole bunch of fun stuff there.
So you were at Mozilla, and then you went over to the enemy. What is Google.org exactly?
Yeah, see, that's, yes, it's not quite the enemy, luckily. So Google.org is Google's philanthropic arm. It was founded the day Google went public, and had basically, you might be familiar with the 1-1-1 model Salesforce.com has, which is 1% of their capital, 1% of their time, and 1% of their ongoing profits they donate to social causes through the Salesforce Foundation. Google.org was set up in a very similar way, so they got a pretty decent endowment from the IPO. They have access to Google's talent, which they can use. As well as have an ongoing budget, which they get from Google's operating expenses. And the aim is to leverage all those resources to tackle some of the world's biggest problems using technology, of course. So when I joined Google.org, they went through a little bit of a rebuilding phase, kind of like a version 2 of what they wanted to do. And the whole team was only 5 people. $150 million in annual grants they were giving out, $2 billion in services we were giving out, and at least in theory, 1% of every Googler's time we could tap into. So an incredibly rich playground, as you might imagine.
And now you transitioned over to a pretty rich playground, etc. Singularity University, how did that happen? And how do you see those similarities and differences between the corporate side with Google and then the Singularity is purely philanthropic at this point, right?
Yeah, somewhat. So the transition happened. So I left Google.org. It ultimately turned out it wasn't a really great fit for me. I didn't feel super happy there. There's a lot to be talked about there. I've got the greatest respect for the organization. I really love Google as an organization. And I knew Singularity for a long time, and I basically just randomly bumped into the CEO, Rob Nail, who asked me what I was doing. And I was like, well, I just left Google and kind of figuring out what I want to do. And he looked at me and was like, I want you to work for us and build our startup initiatives. And it wasn't too good an opportunity to pass up, so I joined them. And to your question around like what is Singularity University, I think the easiest way to describe them is they started out as an educational institution, really teaching individuals and organizations the exponential change we're seeing in the world and what to do about this and how do you incorporate this into what you're doing. And out of that, they grew effectively 2 other business units. One is working with corporations, large corporations, Fortune 500s, on kind of like exploring the how So like, how do you incorporate this into your businesses? What do you do about this? As well as the work I did originally, which was supporting startups which leverage these exponentially accelerating technologies to solve some really big problems. And the way we did this was through incubation, acceleration, and ultimately some venture fund activities.
And that's basically how we got connected and your name popped up. So I want to see, what did you learn from working with all of these startups, specifically ones that they're going for pretty big changes if they're working with SU?
Yeah, it's an interesting insight. I think the core learnings we found was that as much as Silicon Valley proclaims it's extremely progressive and like funds the future, what we found is that the larger amount of resources, if not even the vast amount of resources available to entrepreneurs, is really more tied into the shorter time frames. And it makes sense, right? Like if you take a typical VC fund, a VC fund needs to return its capital in a 5 to 7 to maximum 10-year time frame. If you think about some of these really big projects, like if you take something very prominent, like if you are Elon Musk and you build Tesla or you build SpaceX or something, that doesn't happen in a 5-year time frame. It doesn't happen even in a 10-year time frame. This is like 20 years out. But of course, the potential payoffs are massive. And so we found a disconnect for these entrepreneurs between what the perception is in Silicon Valley, this like, oh yeah, you have a moonshot and we'll fund it, and the reality of Silicon Valley, which is like, no, what's your business model? When do you make money? When do you go public, or when can we sell you? So there was a gap, and we started filling that gap, as well as a few other people are starting to fill the gap. And I think it's as these exponentially accelerating technologies are getting better understood today, the gap is filling a little bit better. But that was one of the really big insights we had, these aha moments where it's like, yeah, the resources in Silicon Valley are actually still pretty short and midterm oriented and not long term.
Yeah, they go for the moonshot SaaS companies, but not necessarily the ones that are actually changing the world, which is why certain people have trouble raising funds. Is the answer a 30-year VC fund? Is it working with endowments that say, look, we don't even care, just make the money go up? How can people tackle, I know Singularity is tackling it, but how can this be tackled in a better way?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think it goes back to the question of like, how do you actually structure venture capital? And when you think about venture capital, really, venture capital hasn't changed all that much, and it has a very specific flavor to it, which is 5 to 7 to maximum 10 years, typically 7 years as a median in terms of like capital deployment and capital return. And then you've got these interesting structures around, like you might have heard this, the 220, which is 2% management fee and 20% carry. So meaning I take 2% of the fund and like fund basically my operations with that, and then I get 20% of everything I make on top of it. And I find it interesting that nobody's really questioning these assumptions, right? Until recently. So I think if you see some of these like super funds which are popping up, Andreessen Horowitz probably being the most prominent one there, they are starting to challenge those assumptions. And then you see SoftBank's $100 billion fund totally shifting those assumptions, of course. So I think we're seeing change, and we're seeing like SoftBank's approach, for example, is also a much longer term approach. They're basically saying like, 20-year returns is actually okay for us, and also holding our equity stakes in these companies for much longer is a different way to think about this. So it is changing, but there's structural issues which are really like so strongly ingrained in like just the way we do business.
Well, part of the reason SoftBank's so okay with it is they do have that 2 and 20, so they're making $2 billion a year managing the fund. So it is an interesting conundrum. It's one of those things that humanity's designed for short-term gratification. That's how you survived evolutionarily, and now we're starting to get to the chef versus the cook, where you kind of have to think bigger picture, think longer term, which is why Elon is so crazy and also inspirational, is because he can actually think longer term. How do you build that into people? So that's more or less your mission at Singularity University, is to shift that focus further forward. How do you do that, and how successful have you guys been?
So You're right. I think there's a good chunk of that is actually shifting people's perception and their mindset around this. What we found is typically what happens is that when people connect much more to their purpose, and the big ideas which really drive them, and thinking about seeing careers, their own career. And as an entrepreneur, when you start a company, it's like this is your career, right? Seeing careers as a long-term unfolding and not a short-term, jumping from like position to position or from company to company. Once you do that, like I think you open up your mind to like thinking about, okay, what like really big problem can I tackle and solve? There's a reality, of course, in there, which is like somehow you need to make money, right? In terms of like you need to pay the rent, you need to pay your people, etc. So I think that's the tension every entrepreneur always finds them in, particularly if you're going for the long term, like the moonshot things. As to your question of like how successful are we? I'd say the jury is out, but we have some companies which are hacking at this problem for quite a while, doing really crazy stuff, and seeing and feeling the success now. So probably most prominent three companies I can talk about. Made in Space, they created the first 3D printer which works in zero or microgravity. They have a 3D printer on the ISS, printing replacement parts for the ISS and tools and such. And their big game is, of course, not to create a singular 3D printer, but their big game is to create and manufacture in space, which is crucial if we ever want to be a real spacefaring nation, of course. We have a company called Matternet. They were extremely early in the drone delivery space. So a space, when they started talking about it, basically people they were laughing about them, right? And now, of course, it's much more reality. And then we have a company called Modern Meadow. They are growing leather in Petri dishes. So effectively, they found a process to completely synthetically grow actual leather. And again, like when they started out, people were basically saying you're crazy and this doesn't make any sense. And now they've got they just launched their first collection in collaboration with MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So like these things are coming. None of these companies has made their like big breakthrough billion-dollar company or something, because they're still like years away from that. But we're seeing traction going into the right direction.
And with that, also the meatless foods and all of the things along those lines, you see so much change and innovation happening. It sounds like you're more or less just dealing with a TED conference every single day, which sounds like a dream job. But I have a problem or a question. So
Sure.
If you look at public markets and private markets,
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion, public markets are stupid and short-sighted and reward people for doing things that hurt the business in the long term to get short-term rewards. Private would arguably be a bit of the opposite. So they're focused more on long-term, but still, let's not have too much of long-term, because we got to get our nice cars and raise a new fund. Both of those are a little bit too short-term, but I see the problem of blockchain having instant liquidity, creating that short-term mindset. Are you focused on blockchain at all, and what are your thoughts on the future?
Yeah, interesting. So, by the way, I 100% concur with your assessment around public markets, particularly. It's one of my big pet peeves that the public markets, particularly since we have shareholder maximization theory since like the 50s or so, have created absolutely perverse incentives to be extremely short term and lead to very negative societal outcomes, right? Like it is in a public market setting, it is often advisable for a company to do things which are bad for society, like pollute rivers and the environment or whatever, to generate short-term returns and then get rewarded for that. By the way, there's a really interesting study which was done by, I believe, Harvard Business Review, which said that, and they interviewed Fortune 500 CEOs. They said that 80% of those CEOs they interviewed said that they would forego an investment which will yield long-term high returns for something which boosts short-term their next quarter, which is, this is crazy. I mean, this is bad leadership, right? Ultimately. But clearly, as you said, like the public market incentivize this type of behavior. So 100% agree. Private markets are a little bit better. I agree. blockchain is really fascinating. So I'm looking at blockchain pretty intensively as of late, and I think the jury is really still out. Like blockchain to me feels a lot like the internet 1994, 1995, right? So there's the ICO craze, which is largely all like weird bullshit. You've got the cryptocurrency craze, which is a good chunk of that is just hot air and wildcat banks from the 1800s. And then you've got the underlying technology, the blockchain itself, which has transformative power, in particular in areas where you required trust before, or trust was expensive. So in terms of your question of like, how does blockchain potentially create like longer or shorter term incentives? The interesting question for me is less about the technology. It's much more about what do we encode in our behaviors and contracts, right? So I'll give you an example. So if you think about a public market, I can actually encode in the public market long-term thinking by, for example, giving you voting rights to my stock, depending on how long you hold the stock, right? So if you hold my stock 15 minutes, you have no voting rights. If you hold my stock for 10 years, you actually get voting rights. That is currently not encoded in our public markets, right? Like if I'm an activist investor, I just buy up stock and then I suddenly have voting rights and I can change the course of the corporation. In a blockchain scenario, in like let's say a smart contract scenario where the blockchain, a token represents ownership in a company, like is in an equity token, for example, I could encode these rules in my token, and thus create tokens or ownership shares, digital ownership shares, which are actually aligned with a long-term thinking. So I think it's mostly a question of us encoding it and not the question of the technology itself.
I agree, but that's very dangerous because then you're screwing the future, because then when people want to get involved in the future, suddenly they're more or less worthless and they feel like they own nothing compared to the ones that have been grandfathered in. It's like when you go into a town and you see the guy who has the shithole house that's falling apart and makes everything else look terrible, but he's been here forever, so we can't kick him out.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Of course, you need to be careful about like the secondary effect.
I like that. I like the hard coding idea.
Yeah.
So I want to shift this a little bit, and so I want to bring up something you said earlier. So you said something to the effect of we need 3D printers in space if we're ever going to become a nation that's intergalactic. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was funny that you said nation versus world. And I want to get your thoughts on when humanity goes interplanetary. Will we have nations? What's the future look like? And what are you guys thinking about and brainstorming towards?
Oh my God, that's a really okay. So you caught me on an interesting semantic. Yeah, it's a really good question actually. So on one hand, you have the agreement of the nations of this world currently to say space can't be owned, which I think is a great idea in general. It is an interesting question because I think there's still like a good chunk of individual's identity wrapped up in some construct of community and belonging. I'm not sure if that community belonging is necessarily what we call today the nation state, or there's some theories and like some people like toss them around, and I probably agree with those, is that we're probably identifying on an actually much smaller scale, right? So even in the US, and I'm not a native like living here, like I wasn't born here, but in the US we identify typically with, at the very least, our state, right? We're like, a lot of people don't say like I'm American, they say like, oh, I'm Californian, or even more, they say I'm San Franciscan or I'm New York, right? I'm a New Yorker. So I think there's an interesting like cohesion of like on a much smaller scale where we do belong together. And my hope is that we can then, and I think it's healthy because we need belonging. And my hope is that we can transcend that then into saying, okay, so then as part of like me being like, let's say a San Franciscan, I also belong to this bigger construct, which is called humanity. Granted, current political movements probably don't indicate that this is happening anytime soon, sadly, like globally, right? But yeah, my hope is that when we do this, the step into space, that we can probably leave that crap behind us. But I think time will tell. It's a good question.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't see how you can have an interplanetary species that has nations there's so many problems that come in. It could be interesting to see if and how blockchain could have a better governance structure, but then again, you're fighting against governments to have a better governance structure. It's it's an interesting thing. What interesting topics or challenges are you thinking about on a daily basis or weekly basis?
It's a good question. So I think one is somewhat related to the question you just brought up, which is really around the societal changes and the societal readiness we have for the changes we're seeing brought onto us through technology. So anything from the future of work, what does this mean? Like when we've got more robots and AI and so on taking over jobs and professions, what does this mean for people? To like the way we consume information and how much do we believe information? So the whole fake news debate, etc. So I think that's one big chunk of work I'm interested in, I'm looking at and discuss a lot with experts and politicians around. And the second one for me is I have a deep interest in the future boundaries, if there are some, of what can we do using genetic manipulation, right? So the whole idea of like synthetic biology. So when we start not just curing diseases by like genetically removing them from us or attacking them, but really the question of like, so what does it mean for us as humans? Like, when we can start modifying ourselves, when we can start modifying our environments. Harari, the guy who wrote *Sapiens*, like keeps talking about like we become gods, right? And there's an interesting thing in there. It's like the notion of like creation of something which hasn't existed before. There's really interesting risks involved, and opportunities, of course. So it's a fascinating topic for me.
What happens if it doesn't happen before we're interplanetary? Will there be different evolutions on different planets?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So let me say something probably controversial for my Singularity friends, because like most people in the Singularity University universe they're space geeks, right? And I have a sweet spot for space, but I have a very hard time seeing us. So as a first step, I believe it will be really, really hard for us to get beyond our solar system, right? Just because of distances. And then when you look at our solar system, I have a really hard time believing that Mars, for example, will be such a beautiful place for us to live that we say, instead of having my retirement home in Florida, have it up on Mars. Because everything I see of Mars is a pretty darn, desert, effectively. So with that being said, I do believe we go into space. I do believe we will colonize planets just because we can and because it's in human nature. I don't believe it's like a mass exodus of humans, like from Earth to like Star Trek style, us like zipping around the larger universe. So with that being said, we need to be very careful about this little blue pale dot we have and inhibit, because it will be our home for a really, really long time.
Any ideas on a time horizon?
On when we go to Mars, or
just living off of Earth with more than a couple thousand?
I have no idea. I literally have no idea. I don't think I will see this in my lifetime.
You don't think you'll see it in your lifetime? Okay. Elon would be so disappointed in you.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, Elon, like when I hear Elon's vision isn't like he wants to go to Mars, but I haven't heard him say, oh, and then we'll have a colony of like, 100 million people living on that planet.
His target's 3 million. So that was the entire basis of SpaceX. That was the number that he figured, okay, we need this many people so that humanity doesn't inbreed itself. So then if anything happens to Earth, then at least we have a backup plan. So that was the whole bringing down the costs, etc. We'll have to see. It's a very interesting world, and it's one that everyone is not paying enough attention to because of smartphones and shit, which we were talking about a little bit before. How do we get people more excited about shit that actually matters?
That's a good question. I find like when I talk to people on an individual basis, people actually do care. Like I have yet to find someone who's like sitting there and says like, I don't give a shit that children in Africa are still dying because of malnutrition or something, right? I think the pieces for me, like in this puzzle to get people to really care about like the important stuff is helping people to find something they actually personally connect to, in a like a purpose and a passion sense, and understanding that like, like you might not connect to a particular cause. You might not connect to the fact that, we run out of fresh drinking water in South Africa, for example, but you might connect to something else. So for us to like unearth that, what do you connect to? And then the second one is, the common node I get is this, like, it's overwhelming, I don't know where to start. And I get that. I mean, like, a lot of these problems are pretty substantial and they can't be solved by, a single person sitting somewhere doing something. But I was just on the phone with someone who's doing something around plastic waste in oceans. And he's got this really amazing argument. He's basically saying, like, listen, like, if you care about that subject, like, the simplest thing you can do is don't drink out of a plastic bottle, right? It's a simple thing. It's like, if we all, like, if we're starting to do that, we can actually change the course of history. So it's this, like, getting people like excited about something they care about, and then giving them opportunities and showing them ways to do something which matters. And then there's the if they want to leap beyond that, then really connecting them and say, for you to build a startup, like, think about not building that startup as a, whatever, social mobile photo sharing app, but build something which actually matters.
Let's play devil's advocate a little bit.
Sure.
So you look at the US and you look at China, and they couldn't be more different and they couldn't be more similar. But one thing you'll see is that in the US, people talk about caring. And in China, the government says, okay, we're going to care, but then something actually happens. Do we get to the point where humanity needs a totalitarian government because the masses cannot do the things they should? They become obese. They litter and destroy the world. They do all of these things that they shouldn't because we're based off of short-term gratification, sex, evolution, and all that good stuff.
That's a fascinating question. I recently had a similar debate with someone who made a very compelling argument to say, listen, if you run a billion people nation, you can't run that nation in like a democratic process. And he was contrasting China to India, which India at its core is democratic. Granted, it's like somewhat broken, but it is democratic. And then you've got the totalitarian Chinese model, and clearly the Chinese model seems to work, at least in lots of dimensions, better than the Indian model. I think it's an interesting question. I think the question for me becomes, can you find systems where you preserve individual rights in a meaningful way? So I actually believe, like, ultimately we are post-democracy. Like, we're moving towards a world which is post-democracy. I think that's the short version. What that world will look like, I don't know. We have the Chinese model, and I think the Chinese model has some very clear flaws around, like, for example, your personal freedoms. And yet it also performs fairly well in other areas, as you pointed out. So it's going to be an interesting space to keep an eye on.
Yeah, it looks like a Star Trek 0.1.
Yeah, totally.
So, and let's see if they can take over or not. That's a whole nother story. So what is the most interesting topic that people aren't talking enough about?
Interesting. It's a good question. So one, it's a little meta, and I'll give you a very concrete example. I think we're starting to talk a bit about, like, the ethical and moral implications of technology, particularly around the field of AI. And this is mostly driven by very vocal people like an Elon Musk, for example. I think we're not talking all that much about the ethical, moral implications and what we want this world to be in many other domains. And yet those technologies move forward very quickly. I give you a very concrete example. There's an artist based in New York, Heather Dewey Harkboard. And what she does is she takes cigarette butts, which she picks up on the streets of New York, which on a cigarette butt, there's your saliva, and your saliva is the DNA. So she extracts the DNA, sequences the DNA, and then reconstructs your facial features based on the DNA, and then builds a 3D model, which she then 3D prints and puts into an art gallery next to the cigarette butt. And her whole point is to kind of throw up this question of what can I know about you by the stuff you leave behind, by your traces. And there's a really wonderful video I love to show to like audiences and throw up this question that what she's doing is not illegal. There's not a single jurisdiction, to the best of my knowledge, in the world where this is illegal. But more importantly, we haven't even talked about, like, are we okay with that as a society? Like, do we want this, or is this okay? Or is this only okay in certain circumstances? Let's say, for example, on a crime scene.
Like the serial killer that just got caught from the
exactly.
sequencing.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, for me, that's the big thing we are not talking about, like these deep societal questions. And it goes back to your question or your point about, like, are we moving into a Chinese style economy because it's the only way we can actually manage these complex economies anymore? It's a similar question. And we need to have that conversation.
Sorry, I was muted. Something was up right there. So do you see these type of technologies then, specifically genetic engineering, leading to different races or species of humans within the next 100 or so years?
Yes, unfortunately, yes. So I think that what you'll see is we will have people who will enhance themselves. And we will get to a world, one of my colleagues at Singularity describes this as the super haves and the haves. And the super haves are people who can either through, let's say, genetic modification, but also by technology augmentation, create enhanced body and mind capacities. And there's a really interesting, weird little example is you might remember Oscar Pistorius, the guy who ran on cheetahs, right? These blades. Mm-hmm. And he ran, you might remember, he ran in the abled Olympics as a disabled person. And it was like this big thing where it's like, everybody was like, oh my God, this is so amazing. And if you were part of the hardcore running community, which I was part of, I was an amateur athlete in the space. There was a whole different debate, because the different debate was that the cheetahs, the blades, already had a better energy return than normal legs. So in some ways, you could make the argument that the guy actually cheats, because he runs on something which he augmented his body, not willingly, of course. He didn't cut off his legs to like replace them, but he ran on a technology which enhanced him beyond what the human capacity was, right? And so there was this whole debate about, like, is that actually okay or is it not okay? So it's a really fascinating world. Yes. So I believe we move into a world where we already do augment ourselves. I mean, just think about breast augmentation, right? Like, just the most simplest one. Or like some people like replacing their teeth, or like getting fake hair and all that kind of stuff. And we'll move into a world we will replace body parts and augment ourselves with technology, and we become a different species.
We definitely do, and it'll be interesting, especially in sports, if they keep these things legal or illegal. Because if they're illegal and suddenly you have high schoolers that are twice as strong as LeBron James throwing down on him, you're going to have some problems where the illegal boundaries come in. It's an incredibly interesting field. I want to jump into the lightning round. How's that sound?
Totally, sounds good.
So you were an investor. What was the first investment you made?
First investment was a e-commerce company, which basically did kind of like a couponing thing.
How long were you in VC?
I personally was in VC only about 2.5 years, because I realized the VC fund existed way longer, but I realized for myself that I actually didn't like the VC world all that much, because I wanted to be more involved on the operational side.
So from an operational side, excluding Singularity University-related companies, what are the two most exciting for you today?
Oh my God, Amazon, 100% Amazon. I think it's the most exciting company, the most craziest company you can find. And Jeff Bezos is just insane executor. And the second one it's a really good question. I like a lot of the stuff which Google is pushing forward in like some of their weirder corners, like the Google X world and their researchy world. So I think those two companies are definitely very high on my list to look at.
Google has to. All their money comes from search ads. If we go to voice and we get rid of search ads, Google needs somewhere for that money to come from. What was the biggest mistake you've made so far in your career?
Oh my God, I fucked up so many times, I can't tell you. I honestly don't know. Like, I'm a person who's like, I'm okay making failures and then I'm moving on pretty quickly from it. I don't know if I made. I had the opportunity. I think at one point I had the opportunity to potentially join a company which was called Zalando in Germany, which later became eBay Germany. It was acquired after 90 days being active for $50 million and a whole bunch of stock. And I said no to that opportunity when it presented itself to me. So that was probably one of the dumber moves I did in my life.
Shit, it happens.
Totally.
What industry are you most excited about today?
So outside the usual suspects like AI, I think actually AI is really interesting, and related robotics and other fields. Synthetic biology is what I find really fascinating.
What side do you come down on AI? Are you in the Musk camp or the Bill Gates camp?
So you might know Andrew Ng, teaches at Stanford, was the head of AI at Baidu. I'm on Andrew's side. So Andrew's side is basically to say, listen, we are decades away from what Elon Musk basically predicts in terms of like these evil AIs. And for now, like AI is just basically this, like it's a tool in our toolbox and it does make stuff much better. So I'm really firmly there. I don't believe that AI is a harbinger of like Skynet ultimately anytime soon. It'll come eventually, but not anytime soon.
Okay, as long as Arnold is back in form, then we'll
totally.
be good. So what?
But then we clone this guy, right? Like we just clone Arnold and have like an army of little Arnolds.
Little, if Arnold can ever be little. What resources, blogs, podcasts outside of Singularity University do you go to daily, weekly basis to stay informed?
Totally. So futurism.com is a really wonderful blog, which I adore and read daily. And it's a really great source for like understanding what where the world is moving towards. There's a newsletter called The Exponential View, which I think is a really fantastic, probably the best newsletter particularly around AI and the implications of AI. So between the two of those, I already have a good chunk of my daily kind of consumption, and then I geek out on Hacker News, and that
always
gives me, yeah, right, and it gives me a good overview of like what's happening in the more like nearer term, but like the tech space.
So once we get to the genetic engineering time, we'll just call it that, even though that's a terribly simplistic way of putting it. What would be the first enhancement you want, obviously outside of extending life?
You mean for me personally?
For you personally.
It's a really good question. What would I like? Some enhancements to like in my sports world would be really nice. I mentioned earlier I'm a pretty passionate runner, so having way better VO2 max and being able to like just outrun my age class would be super fun.
Runners get that runner high. Yeah. It's always good. Just takes freaking forever.
That's right.
Thanks for coming today, Pascal. I know you're a super busy guy. You've got a lot of companies, startups, innovators, entrepreneurs, all the good stuff to work with. Where's the best place for people to reach out and say hey?
So one of the interesting things about myself is, to the very best of my knowledge, there's not a single person on this planet who actually has my name, my exact name. So if you Google me, you'll find a shit ton of my information, and you'll find my personal website, which is finet.com, and it has literally all my contact details on it. I'm a pretty sociable person and a pretty open person, so by all means, like, feel free to reach out.
It's incredibly lucky. Matt Ward. What could be more generic? Matt, your typical white guy name. Almost everyone has it. So good luck with the uniques. Thanks for coming on today, Pascal.
Thanks for having me. This was super fun.
Yeah, this is fun. It's been a nice, interesting dive into the future of everything.
Yeah.
And if you guys enjoyed this, say hey to Pascal. Tell him he's awesome, because he is. And of course, subscribe to the show, thesyndicate.vc/iTunes. If you haven't checked out my new project, coral.io, we're funding the 99%. The ones that VCs won't touch. And until next time, just go make it happen, I guess. Cheers. Sweet. Thanks, Pascal.
Awesome.